Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 25 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. We're still in the middle of our deep dive in Roman history, and while the end is almost in sight, there are still some heroes rising up to the challenges of history. If you've followed the story until now, you might rightly ask, what heroes? After all, Hannibal's unexpected invasion of Italy during the first years of the Second Punic War had only resulted in loss after loss for the Roman Republic. In just 3 battles, the Battle of the Ticinus, the Battle of the Trebia, and the Battle of the Lake Trasimeno, the Romans had lost between 100 and 150,000 soldiers, between those who'd been killed in battle and those taken prisoners by the Carthaginians. And since at this time a legionary was not just a soldier but also a farmer, Hannibal's victories had costed Rome not just in terms of military capacity, but also meant a potential stagnation in agriculture. And yet, even though they had suffered nothing but back-to-back defeats, the Romans still chose to endure, raising army after army, knowing that the gods would favor them in the end. When head-on recklessness hadn't worked, the Romans had been forced to accept, through thoroughly clenched teeth, the guerrilla-like tactics that Quintus Fabius Maximus Cunctator had brought to the table during his dictatorship. Seen by many as cowardly and very much un-Roman-like, those tactics had nonetheless given the Romans a little respite from the Hannibalic purges. Unfortunately, though, they had also convinced the warmongering Rome that the time had finally come to retaliate in style. As the Romans were about to discover, though, their charming habit of attacking head-on with little to no strategy whatsoever was about to come bite them in the back in the worst way possible. I would like to welcome you, my fellow travellers, in the thick of the Second Punic War. Nowadays, the 2nd of August doesn't strike us as a date to remember in particular. Sure, on this day in 1776, the signing of the United States Declaration of Independence took place, along with a smattering of other things, but nothing so particular as to warrant a specific calendar entry. But if we had asked a Roman about the 2nd of August, their reaction would have been quite different, with maybe some mumbled incantation or hand gesture to stave off the bad luck. This was because the 2nd of August was considered a dies infaustus, a day so unlucky that even the mention of it might bring bad luck on the people assembled. Think Voldemort and the you-know-who thing? It's basically the same. This was because on the 2nd of August of the year 216 BCE, the mightiest of the Roman armies in history faced off and miserably lost against Hannibal in what has passed into history as the Battle of Cannae. This should have been the battle of the redemption for the Romans, the great comeback after too many defeats in a row. While they had understood its necessity in the end, the Cunctator's strategy of non-engagement had left the Romans chomping at the bit. They were warriors, descendants of Mars, and their pride had been trampled enough by the young Punic general who seemed could do no wrong. While they were itching for a fight, though, previous experience had made the Roman Senate cautious. Hannibal had demonstrated great skills and even greater charisma. A half-baked attempt at going against him would only result in more death than Rome could really afford. But was it really necessary to face Hannibal in battle? In a way, it really was. Of course, the Roman wanted to avenge their bruised collective ego, and only a clean victory in a pitched battle could do that. But there were some serious political drawbacks to the Cunctator's waiting strategy. By continuously not engaging with Hannibal and his troops, Rome was preserving the lives of its citizens, that was true, but was also sending a precise political message to its Italian allies. For every missed engagement, for every battle against the Carthaginians avoided, the Romans seemed to declare loud and clear for all their allies that Rome's power was not enough to win against Hannibal. And Rome's military prowess had been a key factor, by hook or by crook, in convincing the Italian tribes to declare their allegiance to the city of the Seven Hills. With each defeat, Rome not only kept losing valuable citizens and soldiers, but inched closer to the day in which its Italian allies would turn their backs on the descendants of Mars and go right over to pledge their alliance to Hannibal. Exactly like the Gauls had already done. A clean, incontrovertible victory was what Rome needed, and so the Senate once again started levying soldiers. As I said, previous defeat had made the senators cautious, so when it was time to give the orders to march against Hannibal, they sent not just one of the consuls, but directly both of them, armed not just with the 2 usual legions each, but with double that, for a hopping 86,000 heavy infantrymen divided into 8 legions. It was unprecedented, and, according to historian Polybius, a sign of the great alarm and terror at what could happen. In fewer words, Rome was panicking and trying hard not to show it. I think Hannibal probably enjoyed very much the terror the mere mention of his name had instilled into the Romans. And so, in the summer of the year 216 BCE, consuls Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus took possession of their legions and marched towards Hannibal. The Punic general wasn't difficult to find. He had just seized a large supply depot at Cannae, in the Apulian plain in the south of Italy, giving the Romans yet another reason to fear him, since he had just snatched one of Rome's crucial sources of supply. Such mockery could not continue, for Rome was losing face, people, and the much-needed supplies. Varro and Paulus agreed and marched south to intercept Hannibal. As the Roman army marched, it's necessary to point out that since both consuls were on the field and the legions had been combined together to form one single army, the command was equally split between them. That is to say, that one day it was Varro who was in command, and the next Paulus. This wasn't a new strategy, and it had already caused huge losses for the Romans when Hannibal had waited until the more volatile consul had been in command before springing his trap in the Battle of the Trebia. Evidently, the Romans had learned to be cautious, but maybe not enough. To be honest, I'm pretty sure that both consuls were in agreement, at least up to a certain point, but since by stroke of luck it was the plebeian Varro who survived, while the patrician Paulus died in battle, Varro's enemies tried their best to discredit him by shoving all the guilt on him as the one responsible on the day of the battle. By displaying a complete incapability of learning from the past mistakes, Varro allowed himself to be provoked and easily fell in Hannibal's trap. According to the ancient historians, the Roman army was so great that it did outnumber Hannibal's army, so at least on that front, the Roman Senate had done the right thing. In a way, though, such knowledge made them cocky. Yes, they outnumber the Carthaginians, but victory doesn't always ride on the side of the army, but on the capacity of the general. And Hannibal was a proven genius. If the Carthaginians couldn't rely on superior numbers, they had to make their surroundings their strength. By positioning his soldiers with their backs on the sun, Hannibal ensured that the Romans would be blinded by the morning rays shining low in their eyes, while at the same time they were battered by the southeasterly winds blowing sand in their faces, as they were approaching the battlefield. None of this should have made it impossible for the Romans to do battle, and it didn't, but it sure would have made it that much more uncomfortable. The capacity of taking advantage of everything on the battlefield, even things not really related to it, was what made Hannibal a genius. There is also the fact that, while more in number, the Romans were a far less cohesive army than the Carthaginians. Not only a Roman army was normally composed of private citizens, while the Punic army was made entirely of professional soldiers and mercenaries, but in this particular instance, the soldiers had been levied especially for this battle and had little to no battle training whatsoever. On the other hand, Hannibal's army was, at the core, the same army that had crossed the Alps with him, plus the newly recruited Italian allies, and so was loyal to the death to its genius general. The Romans would realize the gap as yet another defeat culled their armies, and in time they would really learn from it. For the moment, though, neither Varro nor Paulus, and definitely not the hodgepodge mint new soldiers recruited for the occasion, could really call themselves worthy adversaries of Hannibal Barca. In hindsight, it's easy to see that despite their numerical superiority, the Roman army didn't have what it took to win. It wasn't because Paulus had been too cautious while Varro too impetuous, nor because the soldiers had barely had enough training to recognize the pointy bit of their swords. The Romans had never contemplated defeat, and that was exactly why they lost, over and over again. Hannibal had taken the time to study his adversaries, the tactics, the weaknesses, and most importantly, the terrain of his battles. The Romans, on the other hand, had kept on executing the same pattern over and over again, ramming their army in their adversaries, much like a battering ram on a wooden door. They had learned nothing from their previous defeats, and their fear of being called cowards had stopped them from picking up a thing or two from Fabius Maximus' guerrilla tactics. In the end, Cannae was a disaster waiting to happen. No quarters were given on the Carthaginian part, and Polybius recounts that the Roman infantrymen were finally all killed where they stood. Figures vary depending on the single ancient historian, with Polybius giving out the highest number of 70,000 Roman dead and 10,000 captured. Livy is a little less bloody, but it still recounts just about 50,000 dead and 5,000 captured. Modern historians are not sure if to believe in such horrific numbers, but everyone is in agreement that this was a massacre. One of the consuls, Paulus, lost his life as well, while the other, Varro, managed to escape with a small number of legionaries who didn't lose their life in the battle, but completely lost their honor. Varro was discredited, but wasn't held responsible for the catastrophic defeat. If anything, the Senate praised him for having extracted how many soldiers he could from the battle, but the legionaries were given a harsh punishment. They were sentenced never to be disbanded, so never to go home again, and sent to Sicily to rot away from the eyes of the Senate. The disaster of Cannae shoved Rome into the depths of despair. The Senate was forced to declare a day of mourning, as there was no one who was not either related or acquainted with someone who had died at Cannae. Out of options and fearing they had been abandoned by the gods, the Romans twice resorted to human sacrifice. In just over 20 months, Hannibal had decimated Rome's power and its population. It's said that in just 3 military campaigns, Rome had lost a fifth of its male population aged over 17 years old. It's interesting to note that, in a way, Hannibal had sowed the seeds of his own future defeat, because the death of so many of the older generation had left the doors open to a young man who could and would prove to be exactly what Rome needed. For the moment, though, Rome was left in despair and on the brink of a political disaster. The Hellenistic provinces of southern Italy, whose allegiance had always been rather unstable, switched over to Hannibal, thus opening up a corridor leading directly to Rome. There was a risk that the city could be taken and sacked, much like it had happened a century before. Such knowledge was for the Romans the stuff of nightmares. They, the great conquerors of the Samnites and Pyrrhus and also the Carthaginians, had been bested by a brat and one single army. I imagine that many senators lost quite a lot of sleep over this. And yet, despite his clear advantage and superiority, and the fact that Rome couldn't deploy another army even it wanted to for lack of soldiers, Hannibal did not march on the city. Such a decision baffled his contemporaries and has baffled historians since. Rome was ripe for the taking, so why did Hannibal not take it? Was it because he thought the job was done even without taking the city? Or was it because, despite everything, Rome's oldest Italic allies had yet to turn their backs on the Romans and could thus be a potential threat to Hannibal's tired army? Or was it because, as some of his soldiers had implied, Hannibal had chickened out at the last minute? I'm afraid we will never know. What we do know are the facts, and the most important one is that Rome and its inhabitants lived to see another day. And if Hannibal had left them alone, hoping that the strings of defeat would have been enough to humble them down to nothing, unfortunately for him, the Romans proved him wrong. The Battle of Cannae is the highest point for both the Carthaginians and Hannibal himself. Had they pressed their advantage, history would have been quite different indeed. But Hannibal didn't, and the next few years would prove that Rome really could be born again from its ashes. At this point, it's time we move from one historical path to another. Hannibal will make one last appearance in our story, but the days when he did as he pleased were long gone. As I said, in a way, Hannibal sowed the seeds of his defeat. Now that the older generation was gone, the younger one was ready to take its place on the forefront. Yes, a lot of them were still untried and untested, but they would learn as they went, counting on personal experience rather than family connections. And from this generation rose the one Roman who would finally bring back victory to his motherland, avenging the city, the people, and his own family. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. If you're thinking you've already met Publius Cornelius Scipio, you're not wrong. The Roman consul who hurried after Hannibal as the Punic general was crossing the Alps was, in fact, named Publius Cornelius Scipio, Senior, as we would call him today. The story I'm about to tell you is his son's, Publius Cornelius Scipio Junior. Junior, now referred to as Scipio for the rest of the episode, was born into one of the most important families of the Republican Rome, the gens Cornelia. They were patricians and had already given the Republic quite a number of good statesmen, including Scipio's father and uncle, who had been sent at the beginning of the Second Punic War to stop Hannibal in Spain. As the eldest son of the family, young Scipio was destined to follow in the footsteps of his father and start the standard Roman political career. In due time, after having held different positions, our young Scipio would have come to the role of consul, at the time considered the peak of their career. Or so it would have happened had the situation been normal. The moment Hannibal had started his march through West Europe towards Italy, though, normality had become a thing of the past. Scipio's father was one of the two consuls that met Hannibal in the Battle of the Ticino, and he would have died there had it not been for his own son's courage. When we think about the Second Punic War, the first name that comes to memory is that of Hannibal. What he did was more than enough to carve an enduring place in history. Scipius' figure is always a bit more in the shadows. In a way, it feels as if the Roman general shines only because he took on the Punic genius and by luck won against him. But there was no luck in Scipius' victory. He was a genius in his own right, on par with Hannibal. His lack of political ability made his figure less important in the Roman minds and in ours, but on the battlefield he was equal, if not superior, to the Punic general. He had a different style, and he went down in history as the first general of the antiquity to understand that he could lead his troops far better from the sidelines than in the thick of the battle. Before him, the style of war had been that of Alexander the Great. A general's valor was measured by how he conducted himself in the midst of the action. Troops were led personally, and those who didn't were considered spineless cowards. Not Scipio, though. How did he manage to be so beloved by his warmongering compatriots if he never demonstrated his courage? Well, he did it once and milked the action for the rest of his life. Scipio's debut on the battlefield happened as he was 17, under his father's command in the Battle of the Ticino. As the head of the family and inexperienced to boot, he had been assigned by his father a small protection detail, while the elder Scipio fought in the thick of the battle as any good Roman commander would have. Inevitably, this brought the elder Scipio close to the Carthaginians, who took advantage of a situation and almost speared him through. He was saved by the timely and heroic intervention of his own son, and this ended up being the very first and the very last time our Scipio entered the battlefield. Did that really happen? Or was it an embellishment of later historians to exalt Scipio's figure further? Modern historians think it's believable, so it's good enough for me. In any case, with his actions, Scipio saved his father's life and made his debut in the military world so dear to the Romans. And when it was time to levy the army for what would be the Battle of Cannae, we know from Livy that Scipio participated as one of the military tribunes. He survived, obviously, and according to a possibly apocryphal story, he also vowed to save Rome from ruin. I can imagine his status as a patrician saved him from being sent to Sicily with the rest of the survivors of Cannae, out of sight as punishment for their defeat. A couple of years later, probably for lack of eligible men, he started out his cursus honorum, his political career, despite his young age, and was given his first position as aediles by popular acclaim. Then, in the year 211 BCE, he received word that first his father and then his uncle had perished in Spain, when the local populations, the Celtiberians, had betrayed the Romans and allied themselves with Hannibal's brother Hannibal. It was a devastating blow for Scipio himself, for the family, and for the state. Scipio had lost his father and uncle. The family had lost the paterfamilias, the head of the family. The state had lost two valorous and valuable commanders and politicians. And after the devastating losses inflicted by Hannibal, Rome didn't have many men like these left. Moreover, what progress Scipio's father and uncle had made in Spain was at risk of collapsing. A new general had been hastily chosen, but the person who had to take up the heavy mantle left by both Scipios had to be picked with very great care. There was only one slight problem. Rome was fresh out of experienced commanders. The new generation was ready and raring to go, but none of them had any experience whatsoever. While Scipio would in time become the very best Rome could offer, in this particular moment, he was the least objectionable option of the lot. Not only was he not that experienced, he had just lost both father and uncle, and wanted also revenge for his family's honor. To give him the very important command of the armies in Spain, the very place where his family had been killed, to fight against the people who had killed his family, let's just say that the Senate wasn't particularly keen on it. Knowing that if this occasion slipped through his fingers, he would never receive another, Scipio appealed to the people. Not only he had a good pedigree and had already displayed some valor in battle, but there were rumors circulating that he could be of divine origins, much like Alexander the Great had been. What we know is that Scipio never hid the fact that he had prophetic dreams or that the gods would speak to him. If anything, he advertised it. Whether it was his reputation or his heartfelt appeal to the people, Scipio got the command he wanted. And without having received consulship, which was usually the main prerequisite to guiding an army, he was sent to Spain. That the Senate allowed this to happen is a good indicator that the situation was really that dire, and no experienced generals were available at the moment. And so it's in Spain the Scipio's story really begins. Gifted with good people skills, he immediately set out to rebuild the army he'd been sent to lead. In time, he would create one of the strongest and most loyal armies Rome had ever seen. His soldiers were ready to die for him, exactly because Scipio always made sure that they didn't have to. He was the first in Roman history to be hailed imperator by his own troops. If he so much had hinted at it, his men would have crafted him a throne. But he was humble and always made sure to act in Rome's best interest, not his. Scipio's Spanish expedition wasn't an all-round success, and at least I can't really see it as such. There had been 3 Punic armies in Spain at the beginning of the expedition, and still 3 Punic armies at the end of it. Scipio hadn't disbanded even one. But he did conquer New Carthage, an act that not only replenished the empty state coffers, but also gained Scipio quite a reputation for being beloved by the gods. The city overlooked a lagoon that changed water level based on the tide, a fact which Scipio had gleefully learned from the local fishermen. He could have simply ordered his men to wait for the low tide, explaining the situation, but Scipio did one better. He declared that Neptune was on their side, and that the god would lower the waters to make his favor known. When the low tide happened, the soldiers all thought that the god of the sea was fighting with them. The conquest of New Carthage was the piece of good news that Rome was waiting for. The people cheered, happy that their choice of general had been a good one. The conquest of the city also netted Scipio quite a haul in silver, which he used to replenish the state coffers. Incidentally, as if this had not been quite his objective, Scipio took revenge for his family by annexing the responsible Celtiberian tribes to Rome. Just before going back, he founded the very first Roman colony outside of Italy, aptly named Italica. Interestingly enough, the city Scipio founded would in time give birth to 2 great Roman emperors, Trajan and Hadrian. When Scipio left the military world to go back to the political scene, trouble started to appear for the young head of the family. For all his military genius, Scipio didn't seem to have been as gifted in the political sense. For example, despite having conquered New Carthage and having given Rome the first victory in quite a while, the Senate denied him a triumph because he had been a private citizen when he had accepted the military commission. Still, ovations from the people more than made up for the slight, and in the end, the very same people who had voted on his generalship in Spain clamoured again to give him the consulship, despite him not having gone through the proper steps at all. This upsetted the conservative faction, but the people had the right to vote, so Scipio got the consulship. Provinces were divided between the 2 consuls, and despite Scipio asking for Africa, his wish was denied by the Senate. Still, Scipio pleaded his case once again in front of the people, telling them it was finally time to bring the war on Carthage soil. Hannibal had terrorized the people of Rome for years, culling their precious men like ripe wheat. His presence was still a cumbersome nuisance in the south of Italy, and according to Scipio, it was high time to bring the heat back to Africa. The people were inflamed. Scipio had given them results, the results they had been waiting for, so they were all in favor of him and his army crossing over to Africa and destroying Carthage once and for all. The Senate wasn't particularly impressed. Yes, the will of the people was important, but still the Senate's word was final. And so Scipio got assigned Sicily, and in a bid to keep him on a tight leash, the Senate gave him the lousiest legions they had, the legiones cannenses. Those 15,000 men who had been rejected by Rome for the dubious crime of having lost the battle. The Senate did give Scipio the right to call for volunteers and the right to sail for Africa if it benefited Rome. They thought they had done a good job in shackling Scipio down. What they didn't know is that they gave him exactly what he needed. The soldiers that everyone thought were mere losers would end up being the pillars of Scipio's strength. These men were veterans. They knew war. They had experienced it. They had already been bathed in blood, and they were no green horse to the horrors of the battlefield. Moreover, they were desperate to prove themselves worthy, to finally be able to go back home, to cancel the shame that had followed them for the last 10 years. For Scipio, these men were godsend, and the feeling was very much reciprocated. The soldiers were instantly loyal to their general, knowing that he was the best ticket out of the hell they had been living. If anyone could help them wash away the shame, then it was Scipio. And even the volunteers were very much what Scipio needed. Contrary to the Senate's expectations, so many turned up that Scipio had to send someone home. Despite everything the Senate threw at him, Scipio kept on preparations undeterred, until it was clear that no one could stop him. Having been the only one to realize that Hannibal had exploited the extreme predictability of the Roman armies, Scipio decided to completely retrain his soldiers. He invented new units, new maneuvers. He gave his soldiers new equipment, bringing about the era of the Roman gladius, the famous short sword of the legionaries. By the end of his training, the soldiers had acquired enough new knowledge that not even a military genius like Hannibal could predict them anymore. It was time to bring the war to Carthage. Scipio's year as a consul was up, but his friends in the Senate managed to get him a proconsulship and finally the Senate's approval to cross over to Africa. Scipio gave the signal. Once there, it quickly became clear to the general that while the individual battles would not prove too difficult, even though the city of Utica resisted mightily through the Roman siege, the conquest of the Punic state would take quite some time. Not only that, but the Senate had no intention to send any kind of reinforcement. Scipio and his men were on their own in Africa. It wasn't an insurmountable problem, since Scipio had been able to count on the help of the Numidian king Massinissa and his cavalry, but he still had less men than he might have wanted. To compensate for that, though, the men he did have were top-notch, and so they scored one victory after another. Soon enough, Scipio and his army were at the gates of Carthage. The Punic Senate panicked and did what it should have done at the beginning of the invasion. They called Hannibal back. We had left the Punic general earlier in the episode as the undeniable victor at Cannae, but the following years had not been kind to Hannibal. His goal of breaking up Rome's alliance system had failed, and the Cunctator's strategy of non-engagement had effectively pinned him in the south of Italy. It must have been very, very frustrating for the Carthaginian. His requests for backup had gone unheeded for years, leaving him in this limbo, and now he had been recalled home without having really obtained what he had come in Italy to get. Historians of the time tell us that Hannibal was heard cursing the gods and the Senate as the Italian coast faded from view. With its best general back on home soil, it was time for the Carthaginians to go on the offensive. And finally, the two undiscussed protagonists of the Second Punic War met face to face on October 19th, 202 BCE in the plains of Zama. We know that the two generals met before the battle as Hannibal had requested in a last-ditch attempt to negotiate a peace. Words proved ineffective, so they led their armies beside the victor. We will never know if it had been because Hannibal had been worn and tired and his army was not the best Carthage had to offer, or if Scipio's tactics and legionaries were really the best. What we know is that this time it was Rome's turn to score a victory. The Battle of Zama was a colossal defeat for Hannibal and his army. At the same time, it was also the redemption that Rome and the Legiones Cannensis had been waiting for. The soldiers knew they had backed the right general. Now they were pariahs no more. They were heroes. The peace treaty that the Roman Senate imposed on the Carthaginians was unbearably humiliating, all but stripping Carthage of its autonomy and self-government. The triumph for Scipio was complete. We don't know if it was the people, his soldiers, or his friends who started it, but Scipio gained his famous cognomen in this occasion, Africanus, the only Roman until that moment to be awarded the title of the people he had submitted. Having restored Rome's honor with his victory and replenished the state coffers, Scipio had reached the pinnacle. The people were so pleased with him that they offered to make him a perpetual dictator. While Caesar would have accepted on the spot, as he would make clear to Rome only some decades later, Scipio demurred and even scolded the people for having tried to make him like a king, a taboo word for the Romans if you remember. Scipio could have had anything he wanted, and not even his political adversaries could have stopped him. But surprisingly, we see him vanish from the scenes after his great victory. Yes, it was true that according to Roman custom, he could not have been made consul again before 10 years, but he still could have endorsed another candidate and created his own faction. We don't know why he preferred to simply vanish, and when he did finally resurface, he seemed incapable to find that spark that had made him so beloved again, opening himself up to attacks from his enemies. In the end, probably tired and ill, Scipio voluntarily exiled himself to Liternium in Campania, where he lived the remainder of his life, surrounded by his beloved soldiers and away from Rome, a city who had given him his greater triumph, but which had also done him and his family dirty in the last year of his life. He died in 183 BCE, allegedly in the same period when Hannibal killed himself in Libissa. According to legend, his last words were, "Ungrateful country, thou shalt not possess even my bones." His tomb was never found, fueling the legend of a man whose great actions had given Rome and his people their honor back. And so, in partial obscurity, died the man who could have had anything, but chose his motherland above himself. Had Scipio been an even slightly lesser man, our history and our present would have looked very different indeed. Despite the strangling peace treaty, Rome would go on to completely destroy Carthage during the Third and final Punic War, with a hero who was none other than Scipio's Africanus grandson, Scipio Aemilianus. After centuries of maritime expansion in the Mediterranean, Carthage was reduced to nothing more than ruins with salt sprinkled on the top. Rome was ready for its next phase. The republican institutions were beginning to feel stale. A revolution was coming, and it would completely change Rome and its inhabitants. I bid you goodbye for now, my fellow travelers, and wait for you here in 2 weeks, when we'll finally set the stage for the last part of our deep dive. In the meantime, I invite you once again to join me on my Instagram channel, The Apple and the Hero. And when you do, please say hi. I'm very happy to make your acquaintance. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me. Sarah Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.